Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. San Diego County, California. February 14th, 1995. Not the kind of night that sticks out in a place where mild winters feel more like spring. But inside a modest tan duplex in Oceanside, something split the night in two. A double blast, then silence. This wasn't a break-in. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't even a mystery. Not at first glance. The shooter was still inside the home, sitting on the steps when officers arrived. A former Marine. Calm, oddly so. The man she shot, her husband, a rising name in professional bodybuilding. 36 years old, 6'3", 230 pounds of lean muscle, 2 bullets, one to the abdomen, one to the face. What the responding officers stepped into that night was not chaos. It was clinical. Clean floors, a shotgun resting on the stairs. The shooter's statement was immediate and unflinching. He was choking me. I thought he was going to kill me. But seasoned investigators know this much. Statements like that are only the beginning. Ray McNeil's body was still warm when paramedics got there. He was barely alive, but unresponsive. The scene was strange from the start. There were no overturned chairs, no broken glass, no defensive wounds on Sally McNeil, the woman who had just said she was attacked. And yet 2 children were in the house when it happened. No one screamed loud enough for the neighbors to call. No one ran for help until the gun went off. One detail immediately caught a homicide detective's eye. The shooter said she was being strangled, but there were no fresh marks on her neck, no signs of recent struggle on her arms or hands. And the weapon, a 12-gauge Mossberg pump-action shotgun, wasn't on the floor. It was leaning upright against the staircase, safety still off. She had gone to get it. Inside the master bedroom, crime scene techs began the usual sequence. Document everything. Blood pattern analysis, point of origin trajectory, shell casing recovery. But this wasn't a complex crime scene. It was almost too clean. The trail of blood began in the living room and stopped abruptly. No attempt to flee. No call for help until after the second shot. To understand what happened in that house, investigators would need to go further back. Months, even years. Because when a crime feels too neat, the motives are usually messy. According to records, Ray and Sally McNeil were not strangers to law enforcement. Over the previous 5 years, there had been multiple domestic disturbance calls made by neighbors, but few resulted in formal reports. The couple trained together, competed together, lived under strict bodybuilding regimens that involved extreme dieting, supplements, and steroids. Both had served in the military, both had tempers, but according to neighbors, it was Ray who usually exploded, and it was Sally who always took him back. But history doesn't always explain the present, especially when the forensic evidence starts to contradict every story in the house. That night, Sally told officers Ray had returned home angry. He was aggressive, irate, and threatening. She claimed he had come at her physically, that she ran, that she grabbed the shotgun, that she shot him in self-defense. But when the autopsy was conducted days later, the report told a different story. The first round had entered Ray's abdomen at close range, consistent with a shot fired from standing distance. It wasn't immediately fatal. The second round, which came seconds later, entered through his face. That was the one that killed him, which raised a serious question. If Sally had feared for her life and ended the threat with one shot, why did she fire again? That single forensic anomaly became the center of everything. Not the blood, not the yelling, not the broken marriage, but the gap between the first shot and the second. A delay, a decision, and maybe a motive. In the days that followed, homicide detectives combed through the McNeil's past, medical records, police call logs, gym schedules, financial documents, prescription histories for anabolic steroids. But one thing stood out. A woman who had served honorably in the Marines, now facing a possible murder charge and insisting she had no choice. But as one detective quietly noted in the case briefing, victims don't reload. Long before a shotgun was fired inside the Oceanside duplex, Ray and Sally McNeil were a familiar couple in local gyms across Southern California. Two heavily built bodies in sync, pushing weights, prepping for competitions and, according to many, pushing each other towards something few marriages survive: performance obsession. Ray McNeil, born in 1959, had built his career in the bodybuilding world through discipline and image. After serving in the Marine Corps, he transitioned into professional competitions, winning titles like Mr. California. His physical presence was undeniable. Judges remembered his posing routines. Sponsors noted his potential. To his peers, Ray represented the kind of marketable masculinity that could headline a national circuit. But it was off-stage where that image began to fracture. Sally Dempsey, later McNeil, grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Her record shows a childhood marked by instability, early exposure to violence, and brief brushes with the juvenile system. She joined the Marine Corps in her late teens, reportedly to escape her environment. There she found structure, rank, and eventually Ray. They married quickly. Too quickly, according to her former superiors. Within months, her service record showed a drop in performance and multiple disciplinary issues. In contrast, Ray's record remained clean, his fitness scores exceptional. Publicly, they were a powerhouse couple. Both Marines, both competitors. But the record tells another story. By 1990, Sally had left the Corps under less than honorable circumstances. She was reported for multiple counts of insubordination and violent altercations with other service members. Shortly after, she began working odd jobs and participating in underground wrestling videos, productions where she would overpower smaller men for money, a niche but profitable market at the time. She told one interviewer it helped her pay for supplements and rent while Ray trained full-time. Domestic police reports began surfacing around this time. From 1990 to 1994, Oceanside PD received 6 calls related to disturbances at the McNeil residence. Most were classified as verbal disputes. One report described a neighbor hearing loud banging and a woman shouting for someone to get off her. No charges were ever filed, no photos, no formal victim statements. In statements provided post-incident, Sally later described Ray as increasingly controlling and physically aggressive, particularly after competitions. She claimed he withheld money, limited her mobility, and had extramarital affairs. Yet forensic review of their joint bank accounts showed that both had access to funds, and Sally continued to book fitness-related travel independently into early 1995. Her name appeared on at least 3 invoices for personal training sessions she conducted at private gyms around Vista and Oceanside. The conflicting data raised a red flag for the assigned homicide team. The couple's image, volatile yet codependent, made clear that if abuse was present, it wasn't documented in a way that helped the investigation. The detective assigned to the case later noted, "There were warning signs, sure, but no one documented them. And that's the issue. Hindsight doesn't work in court." Ray, for his part, was not without flaws. Multiple women came forward after his death claiming he had made sexual advances toward them, including a younger woman he was reportedly seeing at the time of his death. Her name was Marianne Myers. Records showed several wire transfers from Ray's account to Marianne in the 6 months prior to the shooting. While the existence of this relationship didn't constitute a motive for anything, it did confirm tensions in the McNeil marriage ran deep and likely ran both ways. Interview transcripts from the couple's children also revealed long-standing volatility. Sally's daughter Shantina, age 11 at the time, told Child Services, "They yelled a lot, loud, almost every day. Sometimes things broke. Sometimes Daddy slept at a friend's house." Despite multiple indicators of strain, their public life remained intact. In early 1995, Ray was prepping for the NPC Nationals. Sally had spoken to a local promoter about returning to the stage herself. Neither showed any outward signs of imminent separation. There were no divorce filings, no restraining orders, no recorded threats. But behind closed doors, they were already unraveling. Their steroid usage, once casual and competition-based, had reportedly increased. Pharmacy logs indicated repeat prescriptions of anabolic steroids filled in both names. In her later interviews, Sally admitted to injecting Ray, claiming she knew the risks, but that everyone in the sport did it. This combination, volatile personality, financial codependence, steroid use, and a shared history of control, formed a profile investigators couldn't ignore. What they didn't have yet was a precipitating event, a breaking point, something that would turn verbal threats into a double blast of gunfire on Valentine's night. But it wouldn't take long to find it. The forensic review of Ray's ATM withdrawals revealed an entry from earlier that same day, $200 withdrawn at 3:17 p.m. from a machine near Marianne Meyer's apartment. Surveillance footage wasn't clear, but the silhouette of a woman in gym clothes was seen waiting near the car. And later, phone records showed a 28-second call placed from Ray's cell to Marianne just 90 minutes before he was shot. The autopsy confirmed what the responding officers already suspected. The blast to Ray McNeil's face was the fatal wound. The shot to his abdomen, while severe, hadn't killed him immediately. There had been a window, brief but measurable, between the two discharges of the shotgun. But as investigators reviewed forensic evidence inside the home, another trail emerged, one that was chemical rather than ballistic. Toxicology screens were standard protocol in a homicide investigation. Ray's results came back within 48 hours. His blood showed elevated levels of anabolic steroids, specifically nandrolone decanoate and testosterone enanthet. These compounds are commonly used in bodybuilding cycles, both to accelerate muscle growth and aid recovery. At competition level, they are rarely taken in isolation. Users typically stack multiple agents for increased effect. Ray's profile indicated not just recent use, but prolonged cycling. Levels of metabolites in his system suggested he had been on a heavy regimen in the weeks leading up to his death. While not illegal with a prescription, the dosages found were well beyond therapeutic use. According to the medical examiner's notes, the levels were consistent with sustained competitive dosing, above recommended clinical thresholds. Investigators turned to Sally's medical records next. Subpoenaed documentation from a local Oceanside physician revealed that she too had obtained steroid prescriptions throughout late 1994 and into early 1995. Unlike Ray's, her levels were lower, but still active. In one recorded interview, she admitted administering injections to both herself and her husband. "It was part of the sport," she stated. "Everyone did it. You couldn't compete without it." But what began as a shared goal, bodily perfection, had spiraled into something more corrosive. Multiple experts brought in by the prosecution during case preparation emphasized the impact of long-term anabolic steroid use on mood regulation. Known in the medical field as anabolic steroid-induced mood disorder, this condition is marked by increased aggression, impaired judgment, and emotional volatility. More informally, it's been dubbed roid rage. Dr. Kenneth Udelson, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the toxicology data, testified in later proceedings that Ray's steroid levels would likely produce noticeable behavioral shifts, irritability, paranoia, possible aggression, especially in a high-stress domestic environment. While this kind of testimony is not enough to establish cause or motive, it adds context. And in violent crime investigations, context matters. What made this angle particularly relevant was that prior to his death, Ray had reportedly been experiencing increasing frustration over stalled sponsorships and limited financial gains from bodybuilding. According to emails recovered from his home computer, he had been applying for work as a personal trainer and exploring real estate licensing. He was, in effect, looking to exit the competition circuit, just as Sally expressed interest in re-entering it. The timeline raised suspicion. Sally was ramping up. Ray was pulling back. Further complicating the picture was the discovery of multiple steroid vials inside the McNeil home. The forensics team cataloged 6 separate compounds in the master bathroom, 2 of which had no associated prescriptions on record. The labeling indicated overseas origin, likely purchased through black market channels. That discovery opened another line of inquiry. Steroid abuse in domestic violence cases was not new to San Diego County investigators. There had been at least 3 homicide cases between 1989 and 1994 in which the perpetrator or victim had been using performance-enhancing drugs. In 2 of those, psychiatric episodes were cited as contributing factors. None of this absolved either party of responsibility, but it reinforced one fact: the McNeils were operating in a high-pressure, pharmacologically altered environment. Sally's interviews following the shooting consistently mentioned Ray's mood swings, rage fits, and dark episodes. She claimed these usually occurred late at night, after training or following a loss at competition. But there was no formal documentation of these incidents. No ER visits, no restraining orders, no psychological evaluations, only verbal claims, which created a split in perception. One version of events painted Ray as a chemically unstable partner who, in a burst of rage, attacked his wife, triggering a defensive response. Another version described a calculated killing, one that took place in a calm, controlled environment after a series of building resentments. Detectives weren't interested in narratives. They wanted corroboration. A forensic pathologist reviewing the injuries noted no fresh contusions or defensive marks on Sally consistent with a struggle. Additionally, fingerprint analysis on the shotgun showed full contact prints. No smudging, no overlapping of another party's hands. The grip was clean. That meant no one had tried to wrestle the gun from her. The shotgun's safety had been disengaged before firing. The pump action had cycled manually between rounds. These were deliberate, sequenced actions, not reflexive. No witnesses had seen the altercation. The children were in separate rooms, doors closed. What they heard was limited. Raised voices, too loud blasts. No one heard a scream for help. No one reported hearing glass breaking or furniture overturned. What remained was a forensic profile that left more questions than answers. In a closed-door meeting weeks later, one of the lead detectives summarized the challenge. The steroid angle explains mood, it doesn't explain motive, and it sure as hell doesn't explain two shots. The McNeil children were not witnesses in the traditional sense. They didn't see the shooting, but they were home, and in cases like this, that matters. Shantina and John, ages 11 and 9 at the time, had been in their respective bedrooms when the gun went off. Their doors were closed. The TV in the living room had been on low volume. Yet within minutes of the incident, both children provided statements to law enforcement. Statements that would later become critical in reconstructing the domestic environment inside that duplex on February 14, 1995. Detectives from Oceanside PD, joined by a child services advocate, conducted their first interviews less than 48 hours after the shooting. The interviews were recorded, transcribed, and reviewed by forensic psychologists. The priority wasn't emotional impact, it was sequence. What did they hear and when? Shantina's statement, consistent across two interviews, placed both parents in the kitchen around 9:30 p.m. She heard voices, raised but not screaming. She heard movement. The refrigerator opened, closed. Then silence. Then two gunshots, spaced by what she estimated to be a couple of seconds. She didn't hear furniture being thrown or a scuffle, but she did hear footsteps after the second blast. John's account was more limited. He recalled the sounds but admitted he had covered his head with a pillow. Both children said their mother told them to stay in their rooms, not to come out, and not to call anyone. This direction came after the shooting. That statement raised immediate questions for the investigators. If the shooting was truly spontaneous and defensive, why did Sally instruct her children to isolate after the event, not during? But verbal testimony from minors isn't enough. Investigators needed physical correlation. Crime scene analysts returned to the duplex to conduct a room-to-room acoustic test using the same make and model of shotgun fired that night. The goal was to measure how sound traveled from the kitchen, living room, and stairwell, where the shots originated, into the children's bedrooms. The walls were standard sheetrock with no soundproofing. According to the test, the blast would have registered well above 120 decibels inside each room, meaning both children likely heard them clearly, despite closed doors. The significance of this was procedural. The children heard the moment of violence, but not the moments leading up to it. That left a critical gap. To fill it, investigators reconstructed a forensic timeline of physical activity inside the home. The living room furniture was undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned chairs, no evidence of spilled food or plates. The placement of Ray's body and blood patterns indicated he had been shot near the entrance to the kitchen. The second shot, delivered after Ray had collapsed, showed a different trajectory and angle, suggesting he was either kneeling or prone when it was fired. Sally claimed Ray had attacked her near the stairwell, but fingerprint and DNA swabs from the banister, the staircase, and nearby walls revealed no evidence of a physical altercation in that location. There were no drag marks, no smudged prints, no skin tissue recovered from Ray under his fingernails. Forensic mapping also revealed an inconsistency in the lighting. The kitchen light had been turned off. Only the hallway light upstairs and the entry light near the door were on. A detail small in isolation, but meaningful. If an altercation had occurred, visibility in the kitchen area would have been limited. One more detail stood out. A .22 caliber handgun was recovered from the master bedroom dresser. It had not been used. It was registered to Sally. The shotgun, however, had been retrieved from the downstairs hall closet, stored unloaded. She had to retrieve it, load it, and rack the pump before firing. That process was not instantaneous, and no other adult was in the house to contest the sequence. Investigators interviewed the neighbors again. One next-door resident reported hearing 2 loud booms. Another described hearing yelling, though the time was unclear. None reported hearing sounds of panic or calls for help before the gunshots. In a follow-up with Shantina weeks later, a forensic interviewer asked whether she had ever seen her parents physically fight. The child paused before replying that, "Sometimes Daddy got mad, but that Mommy usually yelled louder." While not definitive, the statement contributed to the overall picture. A house with raised voices, tension, and blurred lines of control. Still, the forensic data did not support the presence of a violent altercation that night. As the lead detective later noted in a closed case summary, the children heard the violence, but not the fight, because there wasn't one. The emotional toll on the children was real and measurable, but their testimony remained strictly factual in the eyes of the investigation. They heard the shots. They followed orders. They survived the night. But their presence introduced a new element into the prosecution's theory. The act wasn't chaotic. It was methodical. And that changed everything. There's a difference between chaos and precision. What detectives found inside the McNeil home didn't resemble the typical markers of panic. No knocked-over chairs, no fresh bruises on the shooter, no blood trails leading in multiple directions, just 2 shots, 1 weapon, 1 body. The shotgun, a Mossberg 12-gauge pump-action, was collected from the bottom of the stairs. Technicians handled it carefully. It had been fired twice. Both shell casings were recovered within 3 feet of each other, ejected cleanly to the right of the shooter's position. That detail mattered. It meant the shooter had remained stationary. There was no pursuit, no scuffle, no shot fired mid-movement. Ballistics confirmed both rounds were buckshot, typical for home defense, but powerful enough to destroy internal organs at close range. The first had entered Ray's abdomen and exited partially through his lower back. The second, fired into his face while he was already down, fractured the orbital bone, and lodged into the base of the skull. The trajectory analysis showed that Ray had been at a significantly lower height when the second shot was fired, either kneeling or already collapsed. It wasn't guesswork. The angle of entry was downward, the range close. Forensic analysis of the weapon itself was telling. The shotgun was not kept loaded. Investigators found 2 additional shells in the hall closet, confirming that Sally had manually retrieved ammunition. She had opened the closet, loaded the weapon, chambered a round, disengaged the safety, and fired. Then she had chambered again and fired a second shot. That entire sequence requires at least 5 distinct physical actions. The absence of hesitation marks, accidental discharges, or misfeeds indicated familiarity with the weapon. Fingerprint analysis supported this. Her full prints were present along the pump grip and trigger housing. No other recent prints were found. No smudging, no overlapping impressions that would suggest a struggle for the gun. One investigator noted that the shell ejection pattern showed a clean path, meaning there had been no obstacles, no furniture between shooter and victim, no signs of movement that might disrupt a clean trajectory. Crime scene photos also confirmed that the television remote remained undisturbed on the couch. A glass of water was still sitting upright on the kitchen counter. A protein bar, partially unwrapped, sat beside Ray's wallet. These weren't dramatic details, but they mattered. They told a story of a home that hadn't descended into violence, but where violence had been enacted with control. Blood spatter evidence further supported the sequencing. The first shot produced forward and lateral spray, wide but shallow. The second, more intense, projected upward and back toward the stairwell wall, consistent with a close-range headshot delivered from a higher position. Forensic mapping ruled out the possibility of a crossfire or unplanned angle. Both shots had come from the same fixed stance. In parallel, the autopsy revealed a crucial point. Ray had undigested food in his stomach, suggesting he had eaten less than an hour before death. That aligned with the timeline retrieved from ATM records, placing him at a nearby location earlier that evening. His hands showed no defensive wounds, no bruising, no broken skin under the nails. Toxicology reconfirmed elevated steroid levels, but nothing else. No alcohol, no sedatives, no painkillers. So the picture formed, not of a man out of control, but of a man caught off guard. It's easy in homicide cases to focus on motive, but sometimes it's the lack of physical resistance that tells you everything. There was no chaos, there was only silence. Investigators weren't just looking for the truth of how Ray died, they were looking for what didn't happen that night. There was no chase, no last-minute intervention, no struggle, just a controlled sequence. Retrieve the weapon, load, fire, cycle, fire again. Sometimes the absence of noise is the loudest part of the crime scene. The physical evidence answered the how, but no case is complete without the why. In the days following Ray McNeil's death, investigators began tracing his digital footprint and financial activity. There was no suicide note, no written threats, no pending legal proceedings between Ray and Sally. But something was building pressure beneath the surface, something personal and potentially fatal. Detectives obtained a warrant for both parties' phone records, bank statements, and home computer activity. The first clear anomaly surfaced in Ray's account, a series of wire transfers to a woman named Marianne Myers. Over a period of 7 months, Ray had sent her a total of $2,980. Not a suspicious amount by criminal standards, but enough to raise questions, especially considering that the payments coincided with overnight trips Ray had taken alone. Further investigation confirmed that Marianne was not a trainer, a colleague, or a family member. She was a romantic partner. Detectives interviewed her within 2 weeks of the shooting. She confirmed the relationship. She said Ray had been staying with her on and off during training periods. She believed Ray was planning to leave Sally permanently. Ray's ATM activity on February 14th corroborated this. That afternoon, he withdrew $200 from a machine located 3 blocks from Marianne's apartment. He had not returned home until several hours later. There was no indication he had communicated this plan to Sally, but investigators noted a pattern in the withdrawal history. Ray had been accessing cash more frequently, often in small amounts, perhaps an attempt to reduce visibility. It wasn't proof of an escape plan, but it wasn't nothing. On the other end of the ledger was Sally's own activity. Her internet usage, though minimal, included searches related to divorce law and California community property guidelines, dated 2 weeks before the incident. She had also searched for housing options within 30 miles of Oceanside. When questioned later, she told investigators she had considered separating, but felt financially cornered. There was no shared will. There were no updated insurance documents. But there was tension around money. The couple's bank account showed multiple overdrafts in the months prior. Training supplements, travel expenses, gym fees, and entry costs for Ray's competitions had drained their funds. Sally had not competed since 1991. Her income came mostly from unofficial wrestling videos and occasional private training sessions. On February 13th, 1 day before the shooting, Ray had received a deposit from a local competition promoter, $500 in appearance fees. That money had not yet been spent. But financial pressure alone doesn't create homicide. Investigators focused on patterns of behavior in the days leading up to the incident. Witnesses at the gym where the McNeils trained recalled a verbal altercation on February 12th. One trainer stated that Ray had told someone, "I'm done. I can't keep living like this." The comment was not specific, but it was memorable. Sally had reportedly left the gym early that same day. Surveillance footage showed her entering and exiting the facility, alone, staying under 30 minutes. Forensic psychologists reviewing the case highlighted a convergence of risk factors: deteriorating relationship, financial dependency, suspected infidelity, history of aggression, and emotional volatility exacerbated by steroid use. But more importantly, they pointed to timing. The incident occurred on Valentine's Day, a date loaded with symbolic weight in cases involving romantic betrayal. Whether or not the day mattered to Sally was never confirmed, but from a behavioral standpoint, it added pressure to an already unstable environment. What drew investigators' attention most wasn't what Sally did after the shooting. It was what she didn't do before. There was no effort to de-escalate, no call to a friend, a family member, or a crisis line. No attempt to sleep separately, leave the home, or remove herself from the perceived threat. According to her own statement, she felt unsafe, but remained in proximity, retrieved a loaded weapon, and waited. The lack of preventive action raised prosecutorial interest. It introduced the possibility that the violence wasn't reactive, but premeditated, or at minimum, opportunistic. An assistant district attorney later summarized it in legal terms. There's a difference between fearing for your life and preparing for a confrontation. One is survival, the other is strategy. Still, prosecutors knew motive would be the hardest element to present at trial. There were no text messages indicating a plan, no journal entries, no threats documented, but the cumulative evidence built a frame, not of spontaneous fear, but calculated control. That frame would become the backbone of the prosecution's theory. And once jurors understood what was happening behind closed doors in the weeks prior to Ray's death, the sequence of shots would no longer appear isolated. They would seem inevitable. By late March 1995, the decision was made. Sally McNeil would be charged with second-degree murder. The evidence, while largely circumstantial in motive, was comprehensive in physical detail. There were no eyewitnesses to the shooting, but everything investigators had uncovered pointed to an act of intent, not impulse. The district attorney's office built its case methodically. First, they focused on the forensic sequencing already established: the pump-action shotgun, the manual loading, the deliberate spacing between shots. Both the crime scene and autopsy reports aligned. This was not a reflexive act of self-defense under physical duress. It was a controlled event, initiated and executed by someone who had full awareness of what they were doing. But the prosecution didn't stop at forensics. They expanded the scope to include Sally's behavior in the weeks prior. Her internet search history, though sparse, included content related to property division laws and gun safety. She had conducted no searches on domestic abuse shelters, emergency hotlines, or local support resources. Prosecutors framed this as indicative of mindset, not someone seeking protection, but someone evaluating consequences. They also presented the timeline of financial decline and growing marital rift. Testimony from Ray's acquaintances painted him as emotionally distant in his final months, more focused on his upcoming competitions and his relationship with Marianne Myers than on resolving tensions at home. His plans to move out were informal but consistent across multiple sources. Sally's defense team prepared a different strategy. They centered their argument around the concept of battered woman syndrome. Their client, they argued, had been living under the long-term psychological and physical pressure of an abusive relationship, compounded by financial dependency and emotional isolation. They acknowledged that Sally had pulled the trigger, but insisted the shooting occurred during a moment of panic when she feared for her life. To support this theory, they introduced prior incidents, some documented, others not, of alleged abuse. One medical report from 2 years prior showed a nasal fracture, which Sally attributed to Ray. Another from 1991 noted bruising along her ribs. While none of these were recent, the defense emphasized pattern. They brought in a domestic violence expert to explain cumulative trauma, how fear can condition victims not to leave, but to survive. The prosecution countered by pointing to the absence of recent police calls, restraining orders, or documented threats. They also challenged the logic of Sally's choices on the night in question. If Ray had truly been attacking her, why not flee? Why not call 911 before retrieving a gun? To that, the defense responded, because she believed it wouldn't help. Legal maneuvering escalated in the pretrial phase. Prosecutors fought to keep the focus on the physical evidence. The angle of the second shot, the lack of defensive wounds, the spacing between rounds. Defense counsel sought to introduce Sally's military background, her history of being disciplined, trained to engage threats directly. Jury selection began in late summer. The case had gained limited local media attention, but not national interest. Most prospective jurors had no prior knowledge. Voir dire centered heavily on perceptions of self-defense, domestic violence, and firearm usage. Attorneys on both sides knew the outcome would likely hinge on one issue: belief. Would jurors believe this was a woman pushed to a breaking point, or someone who made a final, decisive move against a partner she no longer wanted in her life? Behind closed doors, both legal teams reviewed internal timelines, preparing to present each detail without redundancy. Prosecutors prioritized a clean narrative: proximity, control, outcome. The defense prepared to complicate that narrative, to insert emotion where there was structure. Because trials are not forensic laboratories, they are battles for conviction, clarity, and context. The prosecution planned to lead with physical evidence and conclude with motive. The defense would open with psychological framing and challenge every clean sequence the state presented. Both knew that in a case with no video, no direct witnesses, and only two people in the room, one now dead, everything depended on perception. A detective involved in the case later reflected, "We could reconstruct every inch of that house, every shot, every blood drop. What we couldn't reconstruct was fear." That's what the jury had to decide. By the time Sally McNeil's trial began in the fall of 1996, the media had already dubbed her the killer bodybuilder, a label that would stick long after the courtroom doors closed. The prosecution came in sharply focused. Their strategy was simple: present Ray McNeil not just as a victim, but as a man ambushed at home, unarmed, unaware, and ultimately gunned down in cold blood. The physical evidence supported them. Ray had been shot twice, once in the abdomen, once in the face. The trajectory of the bullets mattered. Forensic reconstruction revealed that Ray had been at a lower angle during the second shot. That meant he was either falling or already down. Sally had claimed she shot in self-defense, but the ballistics painted a colder picture. A second shot delivered after the threat was already neutralized. Sally's defense leaned heavily into context: years of alleged domestic violence, steroid-fueled rages, and escalating verbal and physical abuse. They introduced the concept of battered woman syndrome and called psychological experts to testify about the mental toll of prolonged trauma. They argued that Sally's reaction on the night of February 14, 1995, was not premeditated murder, but the breaking point of a woman who had endured too much for too long. But this was a court of law, not a court of feeling. The jury was instructed to assess facts, not emotions. They were told to consider whether Sally's life was in immediate danger at the time of the shooting. The defense's problem was that the 911 timeline didn't support imminent threat. According to dispatch records, Sally made the emergency call after retrieving the shotgun from the bedroom closet, loading it, and returning to the living room. That sequence was not impulsive, it was procedural. The prosecution brought in Ray's Marine Corps colleagues and neighbors, who offered varying perspectives on his demeanor. Some admitted Ray could be intense and intimidating. Others stated he never showed signs of aggression. The medical examiner's report further complicated things. There were no fresh defensive wounds on Ray's body, only the shotgun damage. No bruises, no recent abrasions. The verdict came down on March 19, 1996. The jury found Sally McNeil guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 19 years to life in a California state prison. At sentencing, Sally remained composed. She showed little reaction as the judge read the sentence, only glancing toward her children in the gallery. The courtroom was split. Some applauded justice served. Others wept quietly at the image of a mother taken away in handcuffs. But the legal story didn't end there. In 2003, after years of appeals, a federal court overturned her conviction. The argument was rooted in faulty jury instructions that had allegedly misrepresented the self-defense standard. Sally was released on bail. For nearly 2 years, she lived in limbo, technically free but under constant scrutiny, waiting for the state's response. In 2005, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the lower court's decision. The original conviction was reinstated. Sally returned to prison. It was a cold re-entry. The headlines had moved on, but the system had not forgotten. She resumed serving her sentence at the Central California Women's Facility. 15 years later, in May 2020, Sally McNeil was granted parole. By then, the landscape had shifted. Conversations around domestic violence, PTSD, and gendered trauma were being re-examined. Sally's parole was met with mixed reactions. Some saw her release as overdue. Others viewed it as an erosion of accountability. In 2022, the Netflix docuseries Killer Sally reignited public debate. It reframed the case through modern lenses: gender, power dynamics, steroid culture, and flawed systems. But beneath the streaming narrative was a harder truth. Ray McNeil was dead, and no documentary could bring him back. The interviews exposed deep fractures in how we process violence inside families. When the abuser is also a victim, when the line between self-defense and retaliation blurs. Sally's children, both of whom were in the house during the shooting, offered conflicting memories. They had witnessed arguments, outbursts, and instability, but neither could say definitively what triggered that final night. Their lives, too, were shaped by that event, endlessly revisited in parole hearings, press interviews, and the public imagination. Today, Sally lives in the shadow of her own past. She maintains that she acted out of fear, not hate. The state maintains that fear does not excuse fatal overreach. The law sits uncomfortably in the space between those positions. And that is where the McNeil case leaves us, not with clarity, but with contradiction. A man is dead. A woman served decades in prison. The children lost both parents. There is no satisfying resolution here, only the residue of violence and the systems that try to sort it. Sometimes the law delivers justice, but not closure. What happened between Sally and Ray McNeil left scars deeper than a prison sentence could ever mend. As someone who has walked through every page of this case, I've learned one thing. Pain that goes unspoken will always find a voice, and often it's too late when it finally speaks. If you're in a place of fear, isolation, or control, please reach out. There is help before it becomes irreversible. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think justice was served in this case? Have you ever witnessed a situation where the truth was more complicated than the verdict? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from, or even if this story challenged your perspective. And if this video spoke to you, if it made you think or feel something deep, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Your voice matters here.